Power dies in many ways, but none as grotesque, as chilling, or as humiliating as the slow-motion implosion of King Philip II of Spain. He wasn't felled by a sword. No assassin's blade pierced his heart. No enemy army breached the palace gates. Instead, it was something far more terrifying: his own body collapsing under the weight of divine irony. This was the man who ruled the first true global empire, where the sun never set, and his word could decide the fate of continents. A monarch crowned not just in gold, but in sacred authority. He was God's chosen champion on earth, defender of Catholic orthodoxy, executioner of heretics, and master of kings. And yet, in the summer of 1598, the halls of El Escorial did not echo with the sounds of statecraft or conquest. They reeked of decay. Behind closed doors, inside the very palace he built as a monument to eternal rule, the most powerful man in Christendom lay immobile, festering, his flesh consumed by infection, his dignity reduced to waste. What had once been a throne room of Europe's destiny had transformed into something else entirely: a tomb in waiting. For 52 days, Philip II remained conscious as his skin split, his wounds swelled, and vermin nested within his open sores. His attendants wept, prayed, and gagged in equal measure. Some whispered that his suffering was divine punishment. Others called it penance. But all agreed, what happened inside those royal chambers defied belief. What do we make of this fall from godlike majesty to maggot-ridden meat? Was it martyrdom, retribution, or something more disturbing? Proof that no crown can shield a man from rot. Let us now open the chamber door and step into the stench-soaked final act of King Philip II. The death of a monarch, the undoing of a myth. The first cracks appeared not on a battlefield, but deep within his own body. He once ruled more land than Caesar, more souls than Alexander, and more oceans than any emperor before him. Philip II of Spain, the Catholic king, the man behind the Armada, the monarch whose empire stretched from the gold mines of Peru to the rice paddies of the Philippines, from Flanders to Sicily, from Mexico to Madrid. His reach was planetary, his rule, absolute. But by the spring of 1598, the sovereign whose name commanded armies could no longer command his own limbs. The slow decay began long before his final agony. Gout, relentless and merciless, had haunted Philip since his 30s. It warped his fingers into claws, bloated his joints, and twisted his toes into grotesque knots. Each attack more ferocious than the last. By his 50s, the pain was constant. By his 60s, he had trouble standing without assistance. By 1591, he was in a wheelchair, his body already betraying the throne it carried. And yet, even as his flesh rebelled, his mind clung desperately to power. He read and annotated every decree, every war order, every tax revision. His scrawled no in the margins could seal a nation's fate. It was said Philip never delegated what he could do himself. Even as his hands trembled, even as his pen slipped from twisted fingers, he persisted. But no ruler, no matter how disciplined, can stop the siege within. By June, things shifted. His old enemies, gout and fever, returned with vengeance. But this time they brought reinforcements. Abscesses bloomed on his right knee and hand. Boils, angry red, pulsating, swelled and burst, leaking pus onto silk sheets. Physicians, bound by medieval knowledge, prescribed the usual poisons: leeches, lancing, and bloodletting. They drained him, literally, of life, and the rot spread. Within weeks, the King of Spain, the world's most powerful man, was no longer walking, riding, or even sitting. He lay motionless, able only to turn his head. The sovereign of half the earth reduced to a body that refused to obey. He had once ruled a court where etiquette reigned supreme, where no man entered without bowing, where silence followed his every breath. Now he soiled himself. His attendants, once terrified to speak without permission, now whispered prayers as they scrubbed his filth from royal thighs. No one dared speak of it aloud, but the smell was already everywhere. The scent of the king's decay was so potent, it seeped through stone walls and drifted down corridors like a plague. Perfumed cloths clutched to noses were no longer enough. The king himself ordered the windows shut, not to spare himself, but to spare others from the stench of his body. The palace, once a sanctuary of divine order, now reeked of something ancient and unforgiving: human rot. By July, the sores had multiplied. They spread across his chest, thighs, groin. They wept blood and bile. His bedding, damp with sweat and discharge, became a breeding ground. And then came the lice, tiny, ravenous, unrelenting. First they swarmed his scalp, then his chest, then his wounds. Every attempt to clean him only scattered them. Briefly, they returned, hungrier, more numerous. Some claim they hatched within the abscesses themselves, crawling out from beneath his skin. The most powerful man in Christendom, once believed by peasants to possess the divine touch, was now a host. Not to glory, but to parasites. Servants were assigned to pick lice from his body in shifts. They filled bowls, basins, handfuls. And still they returned. But the lice were just a prelude. The true horror came when the flies laid their eggs. Inside him, maggots began to writhe beneath his flesh. They nested in the deepest wounds, fat, wet craters of decay. They chewed his meat, burrowed through muscle, and emerged from lesions already rank with infection. He felt them. He screamed. He prayed. He endured. Each day, the same ritual: the scraping of larvae, the bathing of wounds, the silent tears of attendants trying not to vomit. And through it all, Philip remained lucid. Worse than the pain was the clarity. He knew what he had become. The man who had ordered heretics to the stake now begged not for fire, but for a release. The monarch who commanded the riches of the new world now cried out from his mattress for his servants not to touch him. For every touch was agony. Yet, even as he rotted, the empire waited for his word. He gave it. From a disease bed soaked in blood and bile, Philip II continued to govern. He met with his heir. He issued decrees. He requested daily mass. He confessed. He endured. But no priest, no doctor, no gold could turn the tide. By late July, bed sores formed where his flesh met the mattress. One on his hip was so vast, so deep, that bone was visible. They called it the crater, a wound that oozed gallons of infected matter each day. Maggots multiplied within it like grains of rice, white, twitching, endless. Flies nested in his nostrils, his ears, his mouth, and the king could not swat them away. He could only feel them, moving. By August, King Philip II had ceased to be a man in the eyes of his court. He was a shrine of agony, a breathing sarcophagus, sacred only because no one dared say aloud what everyone already knew. The king was dying. Not swiftly, not nobly, but in a way that mocked every inch of divine right he once claimed to hold. The lice were relentless. But what truly horrified the courtiers were the maggots. They did not just appear. They flourished. They nested in the cavernous ulcer on his hip, an open wound so deep you could see the pale gleam of bone. They fed on him. They multiplied inside him. Every day, attendants cleaned the wound. Every night, new larvae writhed into existence, as if his flesh itself was generating them. His body was no longer just decaying. It was transforming into a hatchery of rot. Priests tried to bless the room. Incense was burned until the air choked. It didn't matter. The smell, thick, metallic, rotten, permeated every layer of silk and stone. His chamber became a place of dread. Only the most loyal or the most desperate dared enter. Even his own son, the future Philip III, kept away. But the king remained painfully conscious. He asked for religious text. He confessed daily. He prayed, sometimes aloud, sometimes in whispers so soft they seemed aimed not at heaven, but at whatever dark force had claimed his body. And still, his condition worsened. The summer heat was merciless. El Escorial, with its vast stone walls and narrow windows, trapped the warmth like a kiln. The air grew wet with decay. Sweat clung to every surface. The king's sheets were constantly soaked, first with perspiration, then with pus, and eventually with blood. The palace became a place of silence. Servants moved like ghosts. No one laughed. No one sang. The monarchy itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something, anything, to end it. Then came the request. Philip called for a crucifix. Not just any crucifix, but the very one his father, Emperor Charles V, had clutched during his own final hours. That cross, that heirloom of divine legacy, had been kissed by popes and held during war councils. It was meant to bring peace. Philip clutched it to his chest, and still the maggots kept feeding. There would be no miracle, no divine intervention. The king who had built monasteries and sponsored inquisitions in the name of God now lay abandoned by the very heavens he had spent his life defending. Worse still, new afflictions emerged. His stomach bloated with fluid. Edema swelled his legs and belly to grotesque proportions. His skin, stretched thin, split open, creating new wounds, new entry points, new nests. His breathing became shallow, rattling, like a man drowning on dry land. And yet he lingered. Physicians redoubled their efforts, more bloodletting, mercury salves, poultices made from crushed insects and holy water. None of it helped. If anything, it hastened the decay. His flesh began to slough off in places. His gums bled. His teeth loosened. Some say worms were found crawling in his mouth. He couldn't eat. He couldn't speak without pain. But his mind was still there. That was the cruelest twist. Philip II was present for every second of his humiliation. At one point, he was heard saying to his confessor, "I have been treated like an old dude." But what he didn't say, what didn't need to be said, was the bitter truth behind it. The court had already moved on. Ministers were scheming, nobles were leaving. The next king was already being groomed. Philip had become, quite literally, untouchable. A symbol of what power becomes when it outlives the body that wields it. He still summoned his son, though, forced himself to offer counsel, to give warnings. But the boy could barely stand the sight of him. He wept, he gagged, he fled. And who could blame him? The man lying in that bed was no longer his father. He was a warning wrapped in flesh. By the first week of September, the air inside the Escorial wasn't just foul, it was funereal. The king's body had become a grotesque ecosystem, fluid-filled, insect-ridden and collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. Yet it still breathed. But those breaths were no longer human. They were labored gurgles, wheezes laced with rot. With each exhale, a mist of decay hung in the air. The palace stank of death. And yet, death would not come. Philip II was caught between worlds, too alive to bury, too ruined to save. The bed sores on his hips and lower back had become craters. One, described in court records, was large enough to hold a man's fist and required daily excavation. Flesh was scraped away in handfuls. Maggots resisted removal. They dug deeper, retreated into the sinews of the king's thigh, his side, his spine. They were not invaders anymore. They were residents. Priests remained, but now they wore veils. Incense burned day and night, not in reverence, but in desperation. Nothing worked, not holy water, not herbal compresses, not silence, not prayer. The stench was so overwhelming that attendants vomited in corners, wiped their mouths, and returned to the chamber as if it were penance. And still he lingered. Here was the horror. The king was rotting so fast, physicians feared there would be no body left to bury once he died. Preparations for embalming had already begun before he had drawn his final breath. This was no ordinary deathbed. This was a morgue in motion. He could no longer eat, though he sometimes tried. Bits of broth and soaked bread were forced between chapped lips. His abdomen, distended with fluid and infection, ballooned outward. The skin stretched thin and began to tear in places, oozing a grayish liquid that soaked the sheets and dripped onto the stone floor beneath the bed. His kidneys were failing, his lungs filling, his blood pressure collapsing. Yet his eyes, sunken and ringed with purple bruises, remained conscious. Sometimes he cried. More often he stared, unblinking, haunted. The court, meanwhile, was already detaching. Power had moved on. Ministers held quiet meetings about succession. Orders were drafted in the name of Philip III. The guards outside his chamber no longer snapped to attention. Some nobles whispered about delaying the funeral, not out of respect, but because the body might disintegrate before the rites were complete. Philip's final hours weren't marked by solemn reflection. They were a countdown to implosion. The king called for last rites. His confessor approached with oil and crucifix. But even this moment, sacred, intimate, eternal, was interrupted by flies. They landed on the holy instruments. They crawled across the king's lips. The oil couldn't hide the smell. The incense couldn't hide the truth. The monarch of half the world was dying by inches, devoured by inches. The final sacrament was not whispered into a noble ear. It was swatted away by insects. And yet, as the priest finished the blessing, Philip asked that the crucifix be placed upon his chest. Not between his hands, they could no longer close. Not beneath his arms, they were too swollen. It rested there atop a sunken, heaving chest, while flies circled above. At 5 a.m, September 13th, Philip II exhaled for the last time. There was no dramatic moment, no divine sign, just a long rattle, a slump, and silence. He died alone, surrounded by servants too exhausted to weep, priests too stunned to move, and worms that did not pause their feast. The sun had not yet risen on September 13th, 1598, when Philip II took his final breath. But the nightmare his body had become did not end with death. What remained on the bed inside El Escorial was not a royal corpse. It was a collapsed ecosystem of rot. The king's body, so ravaged by infection, maggots, and systemic failure, had already begun to decompose. In fact, parts of it had been decomposing for weeks while he was still alive. Now, with his death officially pronounced, the palace erupted into quiet panic. Courtiers who had tiptoed around his illness sprang into action. The funeral of the most powerful monarch in the known world had to be dignified, majestic, holy. But they were already too late. When the embalmers approached the body, they recoiled. The flesh, bloated with trapped gases and liquefied tissue, was soft, ruptured at the slightest pressure. Lifting him was nearly impossible. The skin peeled away, bones shifted. His body had become so fragile, so degraded, it began to collapse when touched. Still, they had to act. Spain could not afford for its people, or its enemies, to learn what had happened in that bed. They doused the corpse in wine and vinegar. They stuffed herbs into every orifice. Sage, lavender, cloves, rosemary, sacred and profane blended in a desperate attempt to arrest decay. They applied mercury compounds and arsenic paste to slow the rot, but nothing could reverse what had already begun. The embalmers made a decision no one had made for a Habsburg monarch before. Philip II's body would not be displayed. There would be no open casket, no final view of the king by his court, no final procession of nobles past the still visage of their sovereign. The face that had once terrified Europe was now too damaged to be remembered. They sealed the coffin quickly. The rituals were rushed. The windows opened to vent the stench. The chamber cleansed with lye. And then they buried him. Fast, inside the pantheon of the kings, beneath the Escorial, the body of Philip II was entombed, his father Charles V on one side, his multiple wives on the other. The man who had once been emperor in all but name was laid to rest in silence, hidden beneath marble and sealed from view. His legacy sanitized, his death erased from the public narrative. But rumors did not stay buried. Whispers traveled faster than royal proclamations. Couriers from England and the Netherlands, eager for schadenfreude, carried exaggerated, but not inaccurate, accounts of Philip's final weeks. In Protestant lands, pamphlets were printed gleefully, portraying his decay as divine justice. The man who launched the Inquisition had been consumed alive. The man who tried to conquer Queen Elizabeth had died infested. Across Catholic Europe, a different tale was told. Official chronicles emphasized his piety, his endurance, his unwavering commitment to faith. They skipped the lice, the maggots, the rot. They spoke instead of his last rites, his final words, the crucifix on his chest. But the truth, horrific and undeniable, had already escaped. The man who ruled half the world had died not with glory, but with gasping, in filth and shadow. Yet the story doesn't end there. Because the real aftermath of Philip's death was not biological, it was political. Philip III, his son and heir, was nothing like him. Indifferent, detached, disinterested in governance. He had seen what power did to his father, seen it eat him alive, and he recoiled, he delegated, he withdrew. In time, Spain began to unravel, slowly, imperceptibly at first, but inevitably. Territories lost, influence waned, the empire frayed from within. Historians would later call Philip II's death the beginning of the decline, not because of what he failed to conquer, but because of how he died. His end mirrored his reign, absolute, isolated, and decaying from the inside out. The Escorial, once meant to be the epicenter of Spanish power, became less a palace, more a mausoleum. Visitors came not to see where kings ruled, but to view where kings were buried. The bed where Philip had wasted away was eventually stripped and sanitized. The room painted over, the story whitewashed. But the smell, some said, never fully left the stones. Philip II was meant to be eternal, a ruler not just of lands, but of time itself. He built palaces meant to outlast empires, laws meant to silence generations, and monuments carved in stone and faith. But in the end, his body told the truth that power always tries to hide. No throne is immune to decay. He did not die a martyr. He did not die a saint. He died surrounded by worms, screaming into a silence too ashamed to answer. And yet, he never once turned away from faith, nor relinquished control of his empire until his final breath. That duality is his legacy, a man both obsessed with control and utterly powerless in death. What does it say about us? That we remember him not for the empire he built, but for the flesh that failed him. Is that justice, or is that tragedy? Maybe history has not misjudged Philip II, but maybe it has oversimplified him. Was he a monster consumed by pride, or a servant of destiny who suffered beyond reason? And if a king could fall so far, what does that mean for the rest of us? We want to know what you think. Was his death divine retribution, or the ultimate reminder of human frailty? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this story with someone who still believes power makes us invincible. And if this tale shook something in you, subscribe for more stories where glory meets ruin and where history bleeds into the present. Because behind every crown is a skull, and every empire has a heartbeat that eventually stops.